Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for Talent Smart EQ's webinar on EQ and the power of feedback. Today's webinar is hosted by Talent Smart EQ, as I shared. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are the world's premier provider of emotional intelligence training, assessments, certification, coaching, and consulting. We've been in business for almost 20 years, and everything that we do is all centered around EQ or emotional intelligence. So just a quick note, throughout our webinar today, you will hear those two terms, EQ and emotional intelligence, and just know that we are using them interchangeably. They mean the same exact thing. So I just wanted to share that all with you. Before we get started today, I do want to take care of a few quick housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen, all of you should see the GoToWebinar panel, and that panel is where you can adjust your audio and your video settings. Today's webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes. We will be covering about 40 minutes of content, so buckle up. And then, of course, at the end, we do want the opportunity to be able to answer any questions that you may have. So throughout the course of the webinar today, any question that you may have about the content that we cover, feel free to type it right into that question box on your GoToWebinar panel. If you click on that little arrow right next to where you see question, feel free to type that question in, and then we'll try to circle back at the end and answer as many of those as we can for everyone. Additionally, today's webinar will be recorded, so anybody hopping on late or who needs to hop off early, no worries at all. Everyone will be receiving a recording to the email that you registered with, and you'll get that about 1 hour after our webinar completes today. And last item, we are conducting a feedback survey for our webinar on feedback, very fitting. We do at Talent Smart EQ, we really appreciate the feedback that we get from our audience because it helps us continue to make sure we're providing really enriched content that our audience finds really helpful and educational and useful and actionable. So please feel free to submit your feedback. It's a quick 5 questions. We really appreciate that, and we look at all those responses. So without further ado, that does take care of our housekeeping items. I would love to jump right in and introduce our team. My name is Kate Barsby. I am the Director of Marketing at Talent Smart EQ, and I will be serving as our technical producer, or our chauffeur, if you will. Additionally, joining us will be Dr. Jean Greaves. Jean is the founder of Talent Smart EQ and also a co-author of Emotional Intelligence 2.0. Many of you might have heard of that book. It's a Wall Street Journal bestseller, over 3 million in circulation. You can find it basically at any major book retailer or a Hudson News store at the airport. Jean will be serving as our host and subject matter expert for today. And we are actually both tuning in from sunny San Diego. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Jean, and we can take it away. Jean, hello, and can you hear me?
Hello, Kate. Yes, hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm pleased to be here and to talk with you all today. Let's get started right away. I want to take you through an exploration of feedback. This is really about receiving feedback. So I'm going to touch on the types of feedback, assessment options for getting good and better feedback, and then what to do with the feedback once you receive it and how to make the most of it. You'll see here I'll include strategies for handling it. But ultimately, I would love for you to carry with you the belief that you will be grateful for feedback and the personal and professional growth that it can provide you. It might not happen the instant you receive it, but you'll know how to get there, and you will commit to getting there. That day that you feel grateful for the feedback that someone gave you. So, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, feedback is your friend, right? But maybe not exactly at first because it doesn't always feel kind. And then there's the phrase, feedback is a gift. And again, maybe not initially because you won't feel excited about it at first. But I hope to show you how to make it your friend and a gift eventually.
That sounds great, Jean. We look forward to it. So why don't we jump in? But before we start, I think it would be a good idea to get an understanding of the experiences that our listeners have had thus far with feedback. So I'm going to jump right in and pose a quick poll for everyone. I would love you to go ahead and just select your response. I'm going to launch this poll on your screen, and you should see the question: when you receive feedback, how do you typically feel about it? So go ahead and select which one of these answers resonates the most with you. Maybe it's I love feedback and I seek it out, or it depends on what the feedback is. I usually brace myself, or it's I'm not really a fan of feedback for the most part. It's not fun. So go ahead and select your response. I'm just going to give it another moment or two here, Jean. I do see a bunch of answers coming in, so thank you all so much. I'm just going to give it another moment or so.
Okay.
Okay, thank you all. It looks like the majority of everyone has responded thus far. So I'm going to close out this poll, Jean, and we're seeing some interesting numbers. It actually shares that 42% are saying that it really depends on what the feedback is. I usually brace myself. And then 36% do say that they love feedback and they seek it out. And then a smaller percentage at 22% shared that they're not a fan of feedback for the most part because it's not fun.
Yeah, yeah. I was so curious to see what this would be, just as I hope you were too. I think for those of you who love feedback and seek it out, it sounds like you've had some experiences and some successes with the improvement that you can see. For those of you who put it depends or I'm not a fan, you're like most people really, where initially you're not quite sure how to take it. It's normal and it's human, and I want to take you through, behind the curtains to see why that is. And I think you'll have a better understanding, and perhaps we'll all move up into we all love feedback and seek it out. Well, let me go ahead and get started. I want to talk about these 3 common sources of feedback. Informal feedback is the first one. This is from people we know, and it can be unpredictable, right? What is said and when it's said are both chosen by the other person. Like there, you see the grandmother there, she's telling us how our choices could get in our own way, right? You thought you were sitting down there for a cookie, and all of a sudden you're getting life advice. You can also ask people around you what they see is getting in your way. That's another way of seeking out informal feedback. And if you want to seek it out, it'll help to give, the people that you want to talk to just a little heads up about why you're even interested and what questions you have, so they can kind of think on it ahead of time. And keep in mind, that your grandmother may give it to you straight, but most people at work will filter what they say to you directly. Now, there's a second type, which is formal feedback that you give yourself. And this is typically some type of a result from an online assessment. And I'm going to be talking more about this, but I'll just say now that this type of feedback can be very useful as long as you know that it does have some limits. So there's this thing called self-report bias. It does exist, and it varies from person to person. Some people are just kind to themselves in how they respond to questions, and others are hypercritical. But for the most part, I want you to know that research does show when a person assesses their own skills, they take into account a broader context than just their behavior. So we consider things like, this was my intent, or these were the circumstances I was in at the time, or these are my hopes and what I'm up against. This doesn't mean that our scores are wrong on these types of assessments. It just means that they represent the broader context. Now, the third type of feedback is formal feedback from those around you. This is typically planned with step 1 being an assessment of your skills, and it's followed by a meeting to discuss the results. So this feedback shows you how you see yourself and how everyone around you sees you. You may have heard of these kinds of assessments. So one person's perspective may be too narrow, but a group of observations begin to show you how you receive perceptions in your career, and what people think, what people see, and how your words and actions are experienced by them. But this is equally valuable to your grandma's wisdom because it gives you back the power to shape these perceptions. So let's just imagine this. If those perceptions are wrong, you will try to shape their perceptions. But if they're right, you can work to change your behaviors. Both are really critical, and why that kind of feedback is so constructive and helpful. Okay, so now let's talk about what formal feedback is really. I'm really happy to share with you that these formal assessments are a type of opinion survey about you. And it's people's opinions, their perceptions about how you've been operating recently. Typically, they only think back to, the last 2 or 3 months. Um, and it's essentially something that has key differences than among different types. So let me walk you through these and tell you, how they differ and what we're going to talk about. Do you see that first one that's crossed out there, traits or abilities, personality, IQ? That is a whole different topic that we're not going to discuss today. These are personality tests like Myers-Briggs or DISC or the Strengths Finder. An IQ test is an ability type of assessment. We're also not going to discuss the performance evaluations or annual reviews that you do each year, though the feedback that you do get during those can be handled with a similar process that I'm going to show you. So it has quite a few parallels. Now, we are talking today about how to handle the power of feedback you get from yourself or others about your soft skills. These are skills like leadership, communication, and emotional intelligence skills, which is the kind of company that we are in. So our Talent Smart assessments cover a set of questions designed to measure 4 EQ skills. This way, you don't have to figure out what questions to ask your friends or your family or your coworkers. They've been compiled by subject matter experts. You hop online, you assess yourself, and others can also assess you. These are in the multi-rater assessment type. So multi-rater assessments are when you rate your skills and others rate your skills too. So it's a self versus all others that are of average. So this is where you don't get to see who says what, but you can say, here's what I think about myself, and here's what everybody else thought about me. You see in the results report just 2 scores, whereas in the 360, it places your raters in groups. It's called a 360 because it's above, around you, and below you. So your supervisor is above, your coworkers are around you, and your staff is below you. That's where the name came from. So you get to see results where here's what I said, and then here's what my supervisor rated me, and here's how my coworkers rated me, and here's how my staff rated me. And I included team assessments here because I wanted you to know that's another type of multi-rater assessment, and that's where team members can hop online and rate the team on some type of set of team-oriented skills.
Thank you so much, Jean, for clarifying the different types of assessments to really help us kind of get the right feedback that we're looking for. So as you can see, there's a few different ones. But really, what about the power behind the emotions that go with this feedback? I think that that's probably the most delicate part of feedback altogether, because we all know when we get feedback, we're automatically feeling something when we get it.
Yes. Okay. So here's the crux of the matter today. I'm just going to call a spade a spade. Feedback stings. Do you see that beekeeper there? That's you holding the results of your assessment. You're in a very protective mode at that point, wondering if you're going to get stung and feel hurt by a bunch of little numbers or even the comments that are written that supposedly somehow know more about you than you know yourself. So the sting occurs because we expect higher scores than we actually get. We try, we want to be great at everything we do, and we mean well. So scores on a report represent not that, they represent the cold, hard facts. So just what you say and what you do. These are things people can see and hear. They just can't get into your mind. They don't reflect what you intended to do. So this is really why it's so good to have the strength to see what others see.
So our listeners can get some additional clarity, Jean. You're right, feedback does sting, but what actually happens in our minds when we hear feedback? We know that there's a number of different emotions, but I think it's kind of important to explain why that emotion arises, when it arises, and then afterward we can talk about what to do about it. But I think it's important to understand why we're feeling what we're feeling and what's happening in our brains.
Okay, yeah, let me describe the physical process of absorbing feedback. So when visual and auditory signals come into your brain, Your limbic system over there in the middle of the brain, that is the first site where your signals travel. It processes them first and then moves over to the rational brain. That's part, the frontal lobe. That is the place where we think. So the truth is, you can't escape feeling feedback before you ever have a thought about that feedback. You simply can't process feedback rationally without also processing it emotionally. So really, no wonder it stings. It's like a nerve getting poked, and that's why feedback grabs your attention and why you brace yourself for it.
Um, so Jean, then if what you're sharing, it basically is saying that we can't do anything to avoid these feelings. These feelings are going to happen. And then they will process through where we can actually think about them rationally. But are there things that we can do as people to really handle that moment of emotion at first? Because it can get overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. We put little arrows facing each other there in the middle because it's almost like this reverberation system where the signals pass through the limbic system, you have thoughts about it, then you feel more about your thoughts, and that's kind of your brain processing feedback. So, just because you can't prevent the feelings, you can still understand what those common reactions are and then what you can do to avoid processing the feedback incorrectly. So let me go ahead and walk you through that next. Here's a picture of this woman. This is like the first reaction, right? One common reaction is just to shy away from it due to just negative feelings that it evokes and the discomfort you feel. You just want no part of it, right? So after you read the feedback results, that uncomfortable moment may pass, and then you just try to move on quickly. You think it's easier to push it out of your mind, and you don't want to confront something complex or negative about yourself. So let me just say, unfortunately, there's no easy way to make the feedback go away. It's going to hover in the back of your mind. It might, crop up like worry or preoccupation, and now you're thinking like you're not understood. And from the perspective of everybody else, don't forget that once people shared the feedback with you, their expectations are now raised that you might do something about it. So if and when you don't, they may now think you aren't able to take feedback, or you didn't even care, really about what they said. So sometimes doing nothing really can be worse than doing something with your feedback. So the strategy for those who prefer to shy away from it is to lean into the discomfort. This is a strategy that when you first feel it, just tell yourself, here it is. This is the normal discomfort I'm told typically happens. I'm just going to sit with it. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to move through it until it softens. Maybe I'll feel more readiness to learn more. So now you'll feel just much more ready to try making the changes to behaviors that aren't working for you. This leaning into your discomfort is going to help make it go away or to lessen in intensity. And it also, I'll just say, it prepares you to talk about what you've learned with the very people who rated you. And I just consider this, what better way to tell them that you care about them and you want to make working with them easier and more enjoyable. It really does mean the world to them.
Definitely, Jean. And I love what you said that, that feeling of discomfort will eventually go away and it will lessen. So that emotion that we all tend to feel right away when we get feedback, it's not going to be as strong or as overwhelming as it may seem right at the start. If you lean into that discomfort and give it some time, it will lessen and dissipates like a little bit. So I think that that's a really good thing to keep in mind, because that those bad feelings can sometimes kind of really bring you down. And it's important to really think, to understand, that feeling, having those types of feelings are normal. And sometimes you just need to sit with it and deal with that uncomfortable feeling for a little bit.
Yeah, think about it. If you had your own insight, it would be on your timing, your readiness, and now you're kind of excited because you're proud of yourself for having raised your self-awareness. When you get feedback, that's other people trying to raise your self-awareness, and you weren't ready for it. It maybe wasn't the time you wanted to hear that message. So you just need to definitely be kind to yourself at the point of receiving feedback.
Yeah, that's a
Now,
really good point.
yeah, so true. How about a second reaction? This one is one I call it's when you feel overwhelmed. You're going to think something like, I must be inherently flawed. So all, perceived negatives in your report can easily drive you to conclude way too fast that you're not cut out for the position you're in, or you're unlikable, or you'll never get to the hang of managing people, or you're just not a people person, or even ultimately, hey, people don't think I'm very fun, right? So you're not quick on your feet. All these types of negative self-talk thoughts really do cloud your ability to absorb what the real message in the data is trying to say. And this mistaken conclusion people tend to come away with all have one thing in common. They all say, this feedback is trying to tell me I have limitations. But remember this, feedback is not all powerful. Feedback only spotlights your recent habits, words, and actions. It gives you the opportunity to change what makes working with you difficult for the other person, right? Or it improves what people perceive. But you ultimately have the final say. So the strategy to use is to adopt a growth mindset. Let me chat about this for a second. Forming new habits is especially possible with emotional intelligence skills, which research does show are malleable. That's the key thing about EQ. It's something that you can develop. So people improve their EQ with a commitment to grow and a commitment to repeated practice. This is why adopting a growth mindset helps. And the way you do it is this. Just privately talk to yourself before opening your feedback report and remind yourself something like the following. I am not simply a person who doesn't have all of the answers. I'm normal. I'm willing to discover a few new suggestions. People want to help me, and I want to grow personally and professionally. It's just this type of message, right? You don't have to have all the answers. That's all you need to go into reading your report with a growth mindset. Okay, so let's go over reaction number 3. That's when you take other people's feedback way too literally. So if we promise ourselves we're going to do everything that people suggest, the swing there is that you can overcorrect. So for example, a manager might get the feedback that she spends way too much time checking in and chatting with people during weekly meetings. Now, if she takes this too literally, she might go too far and say, okay, I've got to grow as a manager, so I'm going to do this. And you just eliminate all of sort of the banter, all of the interpersonal stuff. And now you find yourself a year later kind of getting a different kind of feedback, which is you've kind of become too businesslike and a little bit cold, and they miss the person that you were. So learn to sift through ratings and comments to understand how these comments apply to you and how they apply to your responsibilities that you have this year. It might take a conversation with your supervisor to say, hey, if I did everything everybody wanted me to, would I still be able to achieve the priorities that the organization is asking of me? Or if you have access to an executive coach or a mentor, they also might be able to help you reinterpret numbers or even comments that come across kind of needlessly aggressive or overly specific words. What you're after is really to understand the kernels of truth or the messages that can really help you. So they're going to either help you do that, your coaches and mentors or supervisor, or you'll be able to do it on your own. And you have 2 choices. Remember, it's to either change your behavior as a first choice or to change people's perceptions of your behavior by sharing more of what leads up to your actions and why you make the choices that you do.
This is really helpful, Jean. And, sifting through the comments, and collaboratively, I think that that's so important because people tend to, when they get a negative piece of feedback, they tend to almost like dial in on it and let it completely ruin their day, or they are just hyper focused on that. But I think it's important to focus on the strengths that are highlighted in that feedback as well and kind of look at everything. So that's not to say like looking at it so high level that you're not really taking in the overall feedback and what it's the meaning behind it. But I think that it's important to really understand how you can apply that feedback to what you're currently doing at work, and not just dialing in on one specific thing and believing that like you totally need to change everything about it because you're doing horribly. So
Yeah.
I think that that's really important. What about the actual action phase of feedback? So we've discussed the typical reactions and then the strategies that you can apply, but how do we actually follow or create a path toward behavior change?
Okay. Yes. Here's a quick story I want to share about an author named Anne Hood. She's someone who's written quite a few novels. You can look her up if you're curious. She says to this day, when her agent gives her a first round of comments on her novels, she spends the next day entirely in her bed moping. So we wanted to show you that. That's not her, actually. I think you knew. Um, I wanted to describe it this way because in many ways, feedback is like a first round of edits on your life story. Something that previously existed entirely in your head, now you find out how multiple other heads experience you. And other people will always notice things that you didn't. And yeah, quite honestly, this will feel like a really big letdown. So big that, you might really want to feel like you want to stay in bed the next day. And the point of this example is when the sting of feedback hits, you have to trust that in time its power will lessen and you will hear the feedback more objectively and more from the other people's perspective. You're going to be better off so that you can do something that you want to do and that they want you to do in order to move forward and improve. So shifting your perspective on how you move through the world does take time. So no matter how positive you are or how growth-minded, it's still okay to acknowledge that at first the feedback stung a little, and just let it sit for a few days or even a week just to digest it. Let its power soften and take back control over it at that point. Here's how you do it. You reread it, but this time with a pen. Make some kind of edits, comments in the column that fit for your life and for what you need to achieve over the next coming months. This is the way you can start putting together actionable next steps. You'll choose one or two simple adjustments to practice, and that really is the first step toward growth.
That's really helpful, Jean, in understanding how to actually take action in terms of the feedback that you're receiving. But what about actually practicing it? So you can create a plan, but as we know, changing doesn't really happen overnight. So what would you do in terms of a good approach, or what kind of recommendation would you make for actually practicing making the changes based on the feedback that you receive?
Okay, well, it's hard to work on 5 things at once. So just consider choosing one behavior to improve at a time, right? That's a good approach. It's like working on a muscle in the gym. So muscles really work through repetition, and so do habits, right? Repetitions stretch a muscle to its limit, and that's where strengthening occurs. The same is true for behavior change. And repetitions and practice help create new neural synapses in your brain. And they do strengthen and they do become so strong that they form the type of habit that you don't have to think about. It's sort of like now you have a new unconscious habit that's better and more productive for the people around you. Now, getting feedback, which is checking in with yourself and others, that helps too midway, but it can be the informal kind where you just ask people if they've noticed a change along the way. Then you're going to practice some more, right? You really want to do it enough where it's over weeks and over months. And when you find out you're not thinking about it and it just feels so much easier, that may be the time where you can more formally reassess.
So for Jean, for that check-in process where you're asking maybe posing some questions to yourself to reflect on personally, or you're checking in with others, what would be a good example of doing that? Because that's still kind of jumping into maybe somewhat uncomfortable territory for some people. So would it be just as straightforward maybe as like asking, hey, you guys, I've noticed, if you've noticed, I'm really trying to get better at trying not to win every debate in our staff meetings lately, or something like that. I'm really trying to work on that. Have you seen any change? Is that like Is that what you would recommend in terms of checking in with others?
Yeah, I actually really love that example. And here's why. The team's going to be delighted that you're working on that. And you may even get kudos from someone or a few other tips. People suddenly become your ally and they're like, oh, if you're working on that, here's like something that I do. I don't know if it'll work for you, but it works for me. Why don't you try it? You may even find that you're going to inspire someone else at the table to approach you later and ask you for some feedback on their habits. It really, it might feel vulnerable and unsafe to do, but it actually exudes quite a bit of strength on your part, and you'll find it's inspiring to other people, and now they just want to just give you all the help in the world.
Yeah, it definitely opens the door, I think, for more collaboration, more support, which definitely lends to, kind of creating a more positive culture all over at work. And it also creates, I think, a lot of probably respect with your coworkers because they now see and hear that, you heard the feedback, you listened, you've taken it in, and you're in the process of making changes. So I think that's a great sign of like respect for your coworkers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That their original input mattered. You care about them enough to do something about it, and now you're just on your way as a learner. And people people give learners so much space to make mistakes, so don't worry about not being perfect at first. All
So,
right. So why
so what
don't I summarize? Oh, you had another thought or question?
Well, I just wanted to discuss this timeline because I know we discussed about the idea of feedback, the reactions you get, the strategies that you get, and then the action phase and the practice phase. But I think it would be good to kind of share with the audience today the amount of time that this all takes because it's not something that happens overnight.
Yeah, why don't I walk you through this and then we'll see if I can take a couple questions before we wrap up. All right, so one of the first things I want to say about this process is don't underestimate the power of receiving feedback, right? And don't underestimate the time you can take to work through it. So notice over here on the left, that in the beginning, after you take an assessment, you're already feeling a little bit of anticipation before reading the results. You're a little worried, like, am I going to find out that I'm just really bad at everything? So you open it up, you absorb the feedback. Now give yourself a few days to, yes, absorb it further, react, feel, mope, stay in bed for a day, whatever. Then set it aside and then notice what's going on in your head or how you're feeling and which parts of that feedback just linger in your head. You just can't not think about it. So you go back, you set it aside, feel what lingers. Now you're going to review it again. Talk about it with someone, maybe to seek some further insights. And this is likely the feedback that's really important to explore and do something about. They thought that they should say it to you, you heard it, and now you can't get it out of your mind. That's likely a priority to you and to them. Now, creating your action plan in the 3 days to 1 week later, that is the moment where you are taking back your power to choose what you're going to work on, what you think will help you grow based on what's being asked of you by your work, by your life, by your supervisor or your company. Now, when you move into the taking action part, that's where even the time, it looks really small over there on the right-hand side, but it's the longest piece of this. Practice your new actions and words for a few months. It just takes time to build new habits, so give yourself permission to just keep at it. You're going to experience a few setbacks because your other old habits were so well learned, you're just going to fall prey to them. When that moment happens, just say, I'm just experienced a setback, but I'm going to keep moving forward. And that's really essentially the whole process. So even if you're taking a self-assessment, don't be surprised that you're starting on a 3 to 6 month process overall. And that's really, there you have it, right? So hopefully seeing this laid out will take away kind of the mystery. It should take away the nervousness about what to do with feedback once you have it. Know there's a little sting coming, but now you know that it can dissipate and you really are the master of your own destiny.
Great. Thanks so much, Jean. We are right just after the 30-minute mark. So I definitely want to take some time to address some of the questions that we've had submitted throughout the webinar. I have seen a bunch come in, which is great. So I would love to take this time to now jump into our Q&A session and pose the first question for you, Jean, which I think is very fitting based on the timeline that you just shared. When do you recommend retaking an assessment?
Oh, okay. Let's see. Well, the first rule of thumb is don't rush it. So we recommend allowing maybe 9 to 12 months to practice before retesting skills formally. Now that's in reference to things like the deep feedback you get in a multi-rater or a 360 assessment. If you're supported by a coach or a more structured process, you could consider doing it earlier, like at a 6 to 9 month mark. I think reassessing at the 3-month mark might be a little early. And if you're waiting a year and a half or 2 years, that's so long that it's almost like you're starting new and forgetting where you were. So I think that sweet spot is the 6 to 9 month mark with concerted support, or if you're just working on your own, maybe the 9 to 12 month mark.
Great, thanks so much. Another question that was submitted, we actually got this quite a bit, was what recommendations would you have, Jean, for somebody who is dealing with maybe an employee or a business partner who's just not open to feedback and they're very reluctant to participate in any type of feedback arrangement or assessment at work?
Okay, yes. Well, not being open to feedback typically means that they're new to it. They may not understand the process I just shared with you. And just imagine they could be having any of those 3 reactions. They might be wanting to avoid pain. They might be thinking whatever feedback they get, they have to just change as a person to make it happen. Or maybe they're worried they're going to find out that they're not competent. Those are what you would call defenses. And defenses there's a reason it's called, like they've put up a wall to defend various things. It could be their pride or the security of being in a position that they're worried they're going to lose. You never know. So I think approaching someone who's not open to feedback means you may want to take a little more time preparing them that you come with kind intentions. You're simply sharing observations about something that would help make your work life with them better. People are often more willing to help another person, but they get really fearful and defensive if they think they have to change themselves. So you might be able to gauge timing is another issue. Remember I said that people defend themselves or react more strongly because they weren't prepared to see it. One of the phrases that might be helpful is you could say, I had some observations that might be helpful to you when you make presentations. Let's just say you see that they have this odd little habit that's getting in their way of being influential. So I have a couple of observations. I don't know if you ever want to hear them. I'd love to share them with you. I think you'd be really good at them. But certainly you've got a lot on your plate and everybody's ready to hear it at different times, and make it an option, and then they think about it and choose to come forward to you. If it's feedback you really feel compelled to give, yeah, you may just say, I'd love to talk with you about something that's important to me, and I want to share how it affects my work or what it is I'm trying to accomplish, and couch it under what its impact on you. I think those are the best guidelines. And then maybe encourage them to listen to a webinar like this. That's also, seems too formal, but I'd love to have them understand this process as well.
Definitely. I think I've heard that before, Jean, that, tending to using I statements, especially during the feedback process or in navigating any type of difficult conversation really, tends to have any type of conversation just a statement land a lot better than you statements of saying, you do this all the time. I don't like the way you do this. I really think you should fix this, as opposed to, I have seen some things and I think it would be really great to share some of my thoughts with you because I think that it can really help you improve improve how you're doing this. You're already doing a great job in many aspects, and I think it would be real. I think you'd be even better applying this.
Yeah, you could
I
say
think
something like, let me share how it falls on my ears. I don't, and what I would consider even more influential if I heard a phrase positioned like this. Now, the listener, right, the person you're trying to give feedback to, they're just, taking in different suggestions. It just gives them back their choice. It gives them back their power to listen or not listen, act or not act, and that's what helps people relax, I think.
definitely, yeah, it makes it a conversation as opposed to putting somebody potentially on the defensive a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
So another question that was submitted, Jean, this is interesting and it's kind of similar to the one that was just posed, is what about an employee or coworker that feels that they are very open to feedback and they say that they embrace feedback, but then when they're finally given that feedback or they get that feedback, whether formally or informally, they tend to get very defensive and they're not very happy. So how would you handle that? Because it's somebody that obviously thinks they have a growth mindset, but they might not necessarily have one at that moment or when they get the feedback.
Okay, excuse me, got a cough here. In that case, it's still very similar to what I just walked you through. Um, Remember that rationally, we know that feedback helps us grow. We've been told that by our teachers. We've been told this by our parents. But in the moment when it happens, our brains are handling that feedback emotionally. So when you see someone who had said they were open to it and then you give it and then they're not, uh, now you have the wherewithal to understand that they still need that time for that reverberation between the emotional and the rational. And you might just need to step back and say, oh, am I commenting on this in a way that's making you feel like you have to change? Really, let me share why I'm sharing this with you, why I believe that you are so capable of considering a couple of suggestions that I have, and that you ultimately have a choice about this. But before sort of shutting this down as a possibility, I'd love to have you understand why I think this could really help you. And then please, by all means, take a little time, just think about it. And I'd love to talk with you again about it at another time. I'll pop in another week if I don't hear from you, because I know we got to address working together on this. But totally take a little time and think about it. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Then when you circle back to them, just pop in and say, I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are. Now, remember, when you do that, sometimes people need to hear feedback from different sources 3 or 4 times before they're really ready to accept it. And you may be the second of 4. You might have to put down what you're trying to get them to achieve for a couple of months, let it happen again, let someone else comment on it. You might not be the 4th person, you were the second, but you're getting them on the path to hear it enough that they really should sort of wake up to it and decide what they're going to do about it. I think if it's a required moment, you might have to consider a more formal process by maybe seeking out HR and sitting down with a skilled party with the two of you if it's that kind of scenario where there's conflict. But if it's optional and you just mean well, please consider giving it, not pushing it and forcing it on your timing. You'll have a much better chance at breaking through if you give them the time to consider it. And one last little comment I'll make is some of the most powerful feedback can be given in the form of a question. When you pose a question and it just hangs in the air, it gives them time to think about it and answer the question themselves rather than you making a formal statement at them.
Great point, Jean. Another question. We are running a little bit short on time, so we
Okay.
only answer 1 or 2 more. But I think this is a really important question because we've actually gotten it quite a bit. this question is, I just retook your self-assessment actually, and I've been practicing quite a bit and journaling. I noticed that even after all this work, my scores actually dropped. I was in the high 70s and now I'm scoring low 70s and even one score is in the 60s. What is happening and is my EQ actually dropping? That's a great question.
Yeah, uh, yeah, this is great. I'm glad this came up. So there's two scenarios. One is it is possible that your EQ skills can, take a step back during times in your life where you may have extreme pressures at home or at work combined, health scare, some kind of a major thing that's distracting you enough, worrying you enough that you're really not present and attending to other people's needs, right? And that's okay. Those aren't necessarily a lifetime. So know that once in a while it's possible. I don't think it's in your case, and here's why. You mentioned that you are making concerted practice, and you also mentioned that you're journaling. Journaling is a wonderful tool for working through self-awareness. And in the cases where people are actively engaged as a learner on their EQ skills, we do find that when they take their assessment again, at times they get lower scores because they now have higher standards for themselves. You now know what self-awareness is. You know what high EQ and relationship skills should look like. So now when you're taking your self-assessment, you're being a little more critical of yourself than the first time when you didn't know a whole lot about it. Now, in that case, it would have been interesting had you taken a 360 assessment because you might have found that you rated yourself lower, but now others are rating you higher because they're seeing your progress that you're making and they're giving you kudos for it. Yeah, now I see your actions and your words showing up in the world. Whereas when you were taking it, you're seeing that you're still not achieving your ideal self, so you're not going to rate yourself perfectly, right? So it's not the majority, but we do see, honestly, about 19% of the time, people find themselves rating themselves harder in the retest. So I'm glad you brought it up. It's an interesting anomaly, and I think you should give yourself a pat on the back for, yeah, for being more knowledgeable and giving you more things to look at in your assessment to consider working on.
Great. Thanks so much, Jean. That is all the time that we have for today. But for all of you who we didn't have the time to answer your question, thank you so much for proposing them. We will certainly have somebody from Talent Smart EQ follow up with you. Additionally, we do want to just remind everyone that for anybody that's interested in learning more about feedback and the power of feedback, feel free. You can visit our website for articles. We do have a Talent Smart article on there for emotional intelligence, the power of feedback. Additionally, we do have some upcoming webinars. Our next one is on April 28th, and that is on EQ and your personality, on introverts, extroverts, and EQ. And that is going to be hosted by Sue DeLazaro, our VP of Programming at Talent Smart EQ. You can register for that at talentsmarteq.com/webinars. And also, as I shared, feel free to visit any of the articles within our article section at talentsmarteq.com/articles. Again, just a quick reminder, everybody can always, of course, find the recording for this webinar. You will get it in about 1 hour to the email that you registered with, and that we will have a feedback survey that will pop up momentarily. And Jean, are there any closing thoughts that you would love to share with our audience today before we close out today's webinar?
Yeah, let me just close with this. Think of feedback as a measure of how much your actual best self makes it into the real world. Don't be afraid of it. You're just finding out how much more you want to push through so that people see and hear all of what you intend, all of what you hope for. Yeah, it's as simple as that. You ultimately have agency in what you choose to do with feedback. So I hope you will be a little less afraid and that it won't hurt so much next time.
Great. That's such a good thought that, it's really just the ability to kind of take you further along that path to your best self. Nobody was born perfect and none of us are perfect. So You know, we should ideally be embracing it. It's not always easy, but we all definitely want to get better at everything we're doing. We do personally, professionally in our lives. So, you know, getting that feedback is really a gift, as you shared at the very beginning. We can look at it as a gift.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jean. We really appreciate it. As I shared, feel free to keep an eye out for the recording via email in about 1 hour. And please, we do appreciate that feedback if you fill out those quick 5 questions that will pop up in a moment or two. So everyone, thank you. And we hope you have a great remainder of your day. Thanks so much for joining us.